My daughter left her autistic son with me 12 years ago and never looked back. I raised him alone and spent almost $19,500 to help my grandson succeed. Now that same boy has built a $3.20 million app. Today she returned with a lawyer and greed in her eyes. I almost broke down, but then my grandson leaned close and whispered something that completely turned the tables. Before I tell you what happened next, if you're watching this, please hit subscribe to her voice. Tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. Hello, friends. My name is Margaret Hayes. I am 62 years old and I live in Asheville, North Carolina. I never imagined that one day I would tell the world what happened to me, but sometimes life leaves you no choice. The story began 12 years ago on a cold December morning when my daughter, Laura, pulled into my driveway in her old blue Honda. I was still in my robe holding a cup of coffee when she stepped out with her little boy, Ethan. He was 4 years old, small and quiet, with eyes that looked older than his years. She looked restless, as if she wanted to be anywhere but there. I asked her what was wrong, but she just stared at the ground and said she could not do this anymore. Before I could ask what she meant, she placed Ethan's small backpack by my feet and told me she was moving across the country for a new job. She said raising a child with autism was too much for her. And before I could even speak, she kissed the boy on the head, got back in her car, and drove. I stood there frozen, watching her disappear down the road until the sound of the engine faded. I remember looking at Ethan, who was staring at the sky like none of this surprised him. That was the moment my life changed forever. I was newly retired from teaching and had plans to rest, travel, and maybe start painting again. But instead, I was suddenly responsible for a little boy who barely spoke and flinched whenever someone touched him. I knew nothing about autism or therapy or how much any of it would cost, but I knew one thing for sure. I was not going to let him feel abandoned twice. The first few years were hard. Ethan would wake up in the middle of the night humming to himself or crying for reasons I could not understand. I would sit beside him and whisper old songs until he fell asleep again. Some days he would line up his toys in perfect order, and if one piece was moved, he would break down and scream. Money started to disappear faster than I could count. I sold my late husband's fishing boat and then our camper just to pay for therapy sessions and special classes. Every dollar I spent felt like a promise that I would not fail this boy. Slowly, he began to change. He started humming along when then one day he pointed at letters in a book and read them out loud. By 6, he was obsessed with numbers. He would write long strings of them on paper and ask me what they meant. I did not always understand, but I kept encouraging him. I bought him an old laptop from a thrift store, and within months, he had learned to code by watching videos online. I did not understand the screens or the symbols, but I understood the light in his eyes when he worked. Time moved fast. Laura never called or wrote, not a birthday, not a Christmas card, not even a message. At first, I waited by the window every holiday, hoping maybe she would come back. But after a few years, I stopped waiting. It became just me and Ethan against the world. When he turned 16, he told me he wanted to build something to help kids like him who struggled to express what they felt. He worked day and night on it in his small room using that same old laptop I had bought years ago. He called it Speak Bright. It was a simple app that helped autistic kids communicate through colors and symbols instead of words. When he showed it to me for the first time, my heart melted. It was beautiful and full of purpose. I told him he had done something bigger than himself, and he smiled, that small, shy smile that always reminded me of his grandfather. A few months later, his app caught attention online. A local news channel covered his story, and within weeks, investors started reaching out. The app took off faster than either of us could believe. Soon, it was valued at over $3 million. I was proud, but also scared. Success has a way of stirring the past, and I had a bad feeling deep inside That feeling proved right one quiet afternoon when a black car pulled into our driveway. A woman stepped out wearing sunglasses and a fancy coat, and for a moment I did not recognize her. Then she took the glasses off and I saw her eyes. It was Laura. My heart dropped. She looked older, sharper, colder. A man stepped out behind her holding a leather briefcase. They both walked toward the porch. I called for Ethan to stay in his room and opened the door. Laura smiled faintly and told me she had heard about Ethan's success and wanted to talk. I could tell from her tone that this was not a visit of love. The man beside her introduced himself as a lawyer and began speaking about rights and legal claims. I barely understood the words, but I understood the meaning. She wanted a share of the money. My hands started shaking. I asked her where she was when that child cried himself to sleep, where she was when I spent my savings on his therapy. She looked down for a moment, but her eyes stayed cold when she said that what mattered was that she was still his mother. The words hit me like a stone. I wanted to shout, but before I could, Ethan came into the room. He stood quietly near the door, holding his tablet, looking at her like she was a stranger. He did not raise his voice. He just asked her if she knew what his app really did. She nodded awkwardly and said something about helping kids like him. Ethan shook his head and said in a calm, soft voice that it helped them find their real voice. Then he turned toward me and leaned close. He whispered something so quietly that only I could hear it. In that moment, my heart started racing because I knew he was about to do something that would change everything forever. I froze for a moment, not sure what Ethan meant when he whispered those words. I looked at her. His voice was calm, but his eyes were fierce in a way I had never seen before. He turned back toward Laura and the lawyer and stood taller, like he had been preparing for this moment all his life. He said that if they wanted to talk about rights, then they should start with the truth. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably and asked him what he meant. Ethan walked over to the coffee table and placed his tablet on it, then opened a folder filled with papers. I watched in silence as he explained that he had already transferred ownership of the app to a nonprofit foundation registered in both our names. Every dollar it made went straight into programs for autistic children. He looked at his mother and said that SpeakBright did not belong to him anymore because it belonged to the kids who needed it. Laura's face went pale. She tried to smile, but her lips trembled. She said he was too young to make such decisions and that she, as his mother, had legal rights to contest them. Ethan nodded and said she could try, but the foundation had already been recognized by the state and every decision had been reviewed by lawyers. Weeks ago, I could see the confusion spreading across her face. She had come for money but found nothing left to take. The lawyer cleared his throat and asked for proof. Ethan handed him copies of the documents and the man's expression changed from confident to stunned. He looked at Laura and quietly said that this was legally binding. For a few seconds, there was only silence in the room. I sat there watching the daughter I once raised with love now shrinking under the weight of her own greed. It broke my heart, and yet somewhere deep inside, I felt a quiet sense of peace. I asked her why she had come after all these years. She didn't answer. She just kept staring at the papers like they were written in a language she could not read. I told her that when she left Ethan, I thought I would never forgive her. But life had a strange way of giving people second chances. I told her she could still be part of his life if she came back with love, not greed. But she looked up and said she didn't need pity. Then she turned to Ethan and said that one day he would understand how hard it had been for her. He looked straight into her eyes and said quietly that he already did understand because he had lived through the pain she caused. Those words hung in the air like a cold wind. Laura blinked and turned away, pretending to fix her coat. The lawyer began gathering his papers in silence. I could feel Ethan's hand shaking just slightly when he placed it on my shoulder, but his voice never wavered. He told her that she could leave, but that she would always be welcome if she ever wanted to know him as a person, not as a source of money. Laura didn't say a word. She just nodded slowly and walked toward the door. Before she left, she turned and looked at the house one last time. For a second, I thought I saw regret flicker in her eyes, but then she put her sunglasses back on and left. The sound of the car engine faded down the road the same way it had 12 years ago. I felt my knees weaken and sat down hard on the couch. My heart was pounding, not from anger, but from the weight of everything that had just happened. Ethan sat beside me, still calm, still watching the door. I asked him what he whispered to me earlier, and he smiled and said that he knew she would come one day, so he made sure she could never take away what mattered most. I looked at him and tears filled my eyes because I realized that while I had spent years teaching him how to survive, he had quietly learned how to protect both of us. That evening, we sat together on the porch watching the sun dip behind the trees. The sky was painted in shades of gold and orange, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Ethan leaned his head on my shoulder and said he didn't hate his mother, he just wished she had loved him enough to stay. I told him that sometimes people break not because they are evil, but because they are weak. He nodded quietly and whispered that he was strong because I never gave up on him. I smiled through my tears and said that he was my reason to keep going when life felt too heavy to carry. The night air grew colder and we went inside to make dinner. The house felt peaceful again, the way it used to before the past came knocking. I watched Ethan cooking beside me, moving with that quiet focus he always had, and thought about how far he had come, from the little boy who once hid behind me to the young man who had just faced his mother with strength and grace. I knew this was not just the end of a confrontation, it was the beginning of something new for both of us. The world might see him as a genius who built a multi-million-dollar app, but to me, he would always be the boy who taught me what unconditional love truly meant. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the couch with a blanket around my shoulders, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator. Ethan's door was slightly open, and I could hear his quiet breathing. I stared at the ceiling, wondering how everything could fall apart so quickly. One moment, you are living your quiet little life, and the next, you are dragged into a storm you never asked for. The next morning, when Ethan came out for breakfast, he looked at me with sleepy eyes and said, "Grandma, are you okay?" I forced a smile and said, "I am fine, sweetheart. Go get ready for school." He nodded, but I could tell he felt my worry. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table staring at my cold coffee, thinking about the years we had built together, the laughter, the small victories, every step he took, every word he learned, every night he hugged me and said, "Love you, Grandma." And I felt this fierce wave of protectiveness rise in me. No one, not even his mother, was going to take him away or touch his peace. I picked up the phone and called the family lawyer recommended by my friend Martha. Her name was Susan Green, and she spoke with the kind of calm confidence that made you breathe easier. She asked me to come to her office that afternoon. It was in downtown Cincinnati. I remember wearing my blue sweater and clutching Ethan's photo in my purse. When I walked into that office, Susan greeted me with a warm handshake and said, "Margaret, I read your message. Why don't you start from the beginning?" I told her everything about Laura, how she left Ethan when he was just 5 and how I raised him alone, how she never sent a single card or call until now. Susan listened quietly, then leaned forward and said, "Margaret, I need you to be strong. This is going to be a legal fight, but not an impossible one. Laura might be his biological mother, but the law values who actually raised and cared for the child, especially if Ethan is now 16 and wants to stay with you." I nodded, feeling a bit of hope flicker in my chest. She asked if I had any proof of Laura's absence. I laughed softly and said, "Proof, I have years of it. School records, hospital bills, report cards, everything under my name." Susan smiled and said, "Good, keep them safe. They might save you later." When I got home, I found Ethan sitting at the computer, coding, his eyes focused, the screen glowing on his face. He looked so peaceful, so unaware of the chaos around us. I didn't want to disturb him, but I asked him gently, "Ethan, if your mom ever tried to take you away from me, what would you do?" He turned to me, confusion in his eyes, and said, "Grandma, you're my home. Why would she do that?" I didn't answer. I just smiled and said, "I love you more than anything." He grinned and said, "I know. I went to bed early that night, but my heart didn't rest. The days that followed were filled with tension. Laura's lawyer sent letters threatening to sue for custody and financial rights. Susan handled them, but each one made my stomach twist in fear. Still, Ethan seemed strangely calm. He was spending long hours working on his app some nights past midnight. He told me, "Grandma, this app will change everything." One evening, I asked him what it was really about. He said it was a platform for kids with autism to learn communication skills through interactive design. His eyes lit up as he explained it, and I realized just how brilliant he truly was. This wasn't just a game, it was something that could help millions of children like him across the country. I hugged him and whispered, "I am proud of you, sweetheart." He smiled shyly and said, "I just want to make you proud, Grandma." Weeks later, something unexpected happened. Susan called me saying, "Margaret, you won't believe this. Laura's lawyer filed a financial claim saying Ethan's earnings from his app legally belong to her as his parent." I froze. The words felt like ice on my skin. Susan continued, "We will fight this, but I need Ethan to be prepared. They will likely question him in court." I hung up the phone and stared out the window, watching the late autumn leaves fall from the trees. Everything I feared was happening, but deep down, I trusted Ethan. He was calm, like the ocean. He had something in his eyes lately, something determined that I couldn't quite read. That evening, when I told him about the court hearing, he didn't panic. He just said, "Grandma, don't worry, I have a plan." I frowned and asked, "What plan?" He smiled slightly and said, "You'll see." I didn't push him, maybe because I knew his quiet strength came from all those years we fought together. Every therapy session, every long night, he had built resilience stronger than any lawyer could imagine. The morning of the first hearing was cold. I wore my gray coat and prayed silently as we drove to the courthouse. Ethan sat beside me in his black sweater, holding his tablet. He looked so composed, like a young man ready for battle. When we entered the courtroom, Laura was already there, her hair perfectly styled, her expression unreadable. Her lawyer sat beside her with piles of papers. Susan leaned toward me and whispered, "Stay calm. Let the truth speak for itself." As the judge entered, everyone rose. My heart raced. But when I glanced at Ethan, he gave me a small nod, that steady look that somehow said, "Grandma, we got this." And in that moment, I believed him completely. That morning, the sky over Madison was dull and heavy, almost as if it knew what kind of day was waiting for me. I sat at the kitchen table holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. My hands were trembling a little, though I tried to hide it. Ethan was sitting across from me, calm and steady, his laptop open in front of him. He looked so much like his grandfather when he was serious, quiet, but strong. I kept thinking about how far we had come, how 12 years ago he was a scared little boy who barely spoke, and now he was walking into a courtroom to face the woman who gave birth to him but never looked back. The thought of seeing Laura again after all these years made my stomach twist. I had played this moment over and over in my head, but no matter how I prepared myself, I knew it would hurt. When we got to the courthouse, the building looked bigger than I remembered. I felt small walking through those glass doors, like time itself was pushing against my chest. Laura was already there, sitting beside her lawyer, looking as polished as ever. She wore a sharp blue suit, her hair perfectly styled, her face painted with confidence. When her eyes met mine, she smiled, that same cold smile she used to give when she wanted to win. My heart sank. I kept my chin up and sat down beside Ethan. I could feel the tension in the air before the hearing even began. The judge entered and everyone stood. My knees almost gave out, but I forced myself to stay firm. When we sat again, Laura's lawyer began speaking. His voice was smooth, rehearsed, like someone who had told the same lie too many times. He said Laura had never abandoned her son, that she had only left him with me temporarily while she worked on her life. He said she had always intended to return, but I had refused to let her. I could hardly breathe. Every word felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Then he began to talk about Ethan app, about how it had made millions and how, as his mother, Laura, deserved her share. I looked at Ethan. He was quiet, his hands folded together, but I could see the storm behind his eyes. When our lawyer, Mr. Hansen, stood, his calmness steadied me. He presented every document I had saved all these years, every school report, hospital bill, therapy payment, grocery receipt, proof that I had cared for Ethan alone without a single penny or phone call from Laura. He spoke about the nights Ethan cried himself to sleep, the milestones I helped him reach, and the years she was gone without a trace. Laura tried to look unbothered, but I saw her confidence falter when the judge asked if she had any proof of support. She hesitated, her lips pressing tight. I could feel the silence stretch across the room, heavy and cold. Then something unexpected happened. The judge turned to Ethan and asked if he wanted to say something. My heart nearly stopped. I wanted to tell him not to, that he didn't owe her anything, but he stood up slowly and I could see the determination in his face. He looked at the judge, not at Laura. And began to speak. I could barely breathe as his voice filled the room. He told the judge that he was 7 when his mother left, that every weekend he would wait by the window hoping to see her car, but she never came. He said, I was the one who raised him, who believed in him, who taught him that he was more than the label people gave him. He said every success he had was because of the woman who stayed, not the one who left. My eyes filled with tears. My heart swelled with pride and pain all at once. I wanted to stand up and hold him, but I stayed still, listening, feeling every word echo inside me. I looked at Laura. Her face had changed. She wasn't smiling anymore. She looked smaller somehow, like the truth had finally caught up with her. Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably beside her, whispering something she ignored. The judge took a long pause before speaking. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but firm. She said the evidence was clear, that I had been Ethan's guardian for 12 years, that Laura had abandoned her responsibilities, and that she had no legal right to any part of his earnings. For a moment, I couldn't move. The relief hit me so hard I had to grab the edge of the table to steady myself. My chest ached with the weight of everything I had carried for years, and for the first time, I felt it begin to lift. Ethan turned toward me, his eyes wet, and gave me a small smile. I reached for his hand, squeezing it, feeling his strength and warmth. Laura sat frozen, her lawyer gathering papers that now meant nothing. She didn't look at us as we stood to leave. When we walked out of that courtroom, the air outside felt different, lighter somehow. The sunlight hit my face and I felt the warmth of it deep in my bones. Ethan slipped his arm around my shoulders and whispered, "Let's go home, Grandma. We did it." I smiled through my tears and said, "No, sweetheart, you did it." But deep down, I knew we had both won something far greater than money. We had won our peace. That night, sleep avoided me completely. My thoughts were tangled like threads I could not untie. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's face, the way his hands shook when he told me about his mother. I kept wondering how a woman could give birth to such a beautiful soul and still carry so much darkness inside her. I sat by the window, watching the streetlight flicker, and thought about every year I spent raising him alone. Every meal, every fever, every school meeting where I was the only one sitting there for him. It was not just motherhood, it was my whole purpose, my reason for breathing. The next morning, I decided to talk to him not as a worried grandmother, but as someone who had survived her share of heartbreak. I found him in the garage, his laptop open and papers scattered across the table. He looked tired, but focused, like someone chasing a finish line. I said, "Ethan, Please stop running after peace in broken places. Sometimes people do not deserve to be found. He looked up, his eyes red from lack of sleep, and said, Grandma, I am not doing this for her. I am doing it for me. I need to show her that I am not that scared little boy she left behind. I sighed and walked closer. I touched his shoulder and said, strength does not always mean fighting back. Sometimes it means letting go. But he shook his head and said, you have spent your life protecting me. Now let me protect what we have built. I did not have the heart to argue. His words carried the kind of quiet determination that only life's pain can teach. That afternoon, he got a call from a news outlet. They wanted to feature his new project, a platform that would help autistic teens learn communication through creative tools. My chest filled with pride and fear all at once. I watched him stand straighter, his voice steady as he explained his mission. He spoke with compassion, with fire that came from deep within. He said, my grandma taught me everything about patience and kindness. If this project changes even one life, it is because of her. My throat tightened. I had no words. After the interview, he came to me and said, I want to use some of the profit to start a foundation in your name, Grandma's Home for Special Hearts. Tears rolled down my face. I did not deserve that honor, but he insisted. The following week was chaos, cameras, people, contracts. I barely recognized our quiet life anymore. And then one evening, a car stopped outside our house. I looked through the curtain and saw her, my daughter, standing there in an expensive coat, her hair perfectly styled. She had the same look she always carried, that mix of guilt and pride. I opened the door slowly, my heart heavy. She smiled faintly and said, Mom, you look good. I did not reply. She looked around like she was searching for something, then asked, is he home? I said no, and she sighed. She said, I know you hate me, but I am trying to fix things. I said, fixing starts with honesty, not excuses. She lowered her eyes and said, I was scared. I did not know how to raise him. I made mistakes. I said, mistakes are forgetting lunch or missing a school play. Abandoning your child is a choice. She did not argue. She just looked older, tired, and for a second, I almost felt sorry for her until she said, but now that he is successful, I just want to be a part of his life again. That sentence felt like a knife. I said, you do not get to show up when the harvest is ready after ignoring the seeds. She grew defensive and said, I am his mother. You cannot erase me. I said, no one can erase you, but you erase yourself the day you walked out. She left soon after. Her perfume lingered long after she was gone. And I sat down on the porch feeling like my heart had been dug out of me. When Ethan came home, I did not tell him right away. I just smiled weakly, made him dinner, and tried to swallow the ache sitting in my chest. That night, the air felt heavier than usual, as if the silence itself was holding its breath. I sat in the kitchen long after Ethan went to bed, staring at the steam rising from my cup of tea and wondering how life could be so cruel. I had given everything to raise that boy, to keep his spirit alive, while his own mother forgot he existed. Now that same woman had returned, trying to claim a place in a story she had abandoned. I felt my hands trembling, not from fear, but from anger. A quiet anger that burned slow and deep like a hidden fire. The next morning when I woke up, the sun was pouring through the blinds, but I did not feel its warmth. Ethan was already at his desk, typing, focused, lost in his work. I walked to him, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, you should take a break, son. You have been up all night. He smiled faintly and said, I have to finish something, Grandma. I am working on an update for the app. I did not want to push him, but I could sense he was using his work to escape his emotions. I said gently, Ethan, there is something I need to tell you. He turned and looked at me, his eyes calm, but tired. I took a breath and said, your mother came by last night. His face froze for a second. The muscles in his jaw tightened. Then he simply said, I figured she would. She sent me an email last week saying she wanted to talk. I told her not to come here. I watched him carefully. He was not angry. He was disappointed in a way that felt heavier than rage. He said, I do not know what she wants, but I am not that kid who cried for her anymore. I nodded quietly, proud but also heartbroken. He did not deserve to carry that kind of pain on his shoulders. I said, Ethan, she said she wants to be part of your life now. He laughed bitterly and said, now that I have money, right? I did not answer because we both knew the truth. After a moment, he said, Grandma, you have done everything for me. If she thinks she can walk in and take credit, she will be very sorry. I looked at him, startled by the calmness in his tone. He was not cruel, just firm, like someone who had already made peace with his decision. Later that afternoon, I went out to buy groceries, and on my way back, I saw a sleek black car parked near our driveway. My heart sank. I knew it was her again. When I stepped inside, Ethan was sitting on the couch, his mother standing in front of him. The tension in the room was thick enough to touch. She was saying something about second chances and forgiveness, her voice soft but rehearsed. He was listening quietly, his hands folded. I did not interrupt, but I could feel the storm building inside him. Finally, he said, Mom, you taught me one thing in life, how to survive without you. She flinched and said, Ethan, please, I know I was not there, but I am your mother. He said, maybe by blood, but not by choice. I was the one who grew up watching other kids with their moms while mine disappeared into her own selfish world. I was the one Grandma stayed up with every night. I was the one she believed in when no one else did. She tried to speak again, but he cut her off and said, I do not need you in my life now, and I do not owe you anything. She stood there frozen, then turned to me with eyes full of tears, as if begging me to help her, but I stayed silent. My silence was my answer. She left quickly, slamming the door behind her. Ethan sat down, his body trembling slightly. I walked over and wrapped my arms around him. He whispered, I am fine, Grandma, but his voice cracked. I said, you do not have to be fine. Not today, not ever. Just be human. He held me tighter, and for a long moment, we just sat there, two souls who had weathered too many storms together. Later that night, when the house was quiet again, I looked at the framed photo of Ethan as a little boy, the one where he was missing his front tooth and grinning at the camera, and I whispered to myself, you will never hurt like that again, not as long as I am breathing. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of the front door opening and closing softly, and for a moment, my heart raced, thinking it was her again, but it was only Ethan leaving early for a meeting in the city. I stood by the window watching him drive away, that same mix of pride and worry, filling my chest like a familiar ache. I made myself coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the quiet house that had once been so full of laughter when he was small. There were days when he would run through these rooms with a toy plane in his hand, shouting that he would fly one day, and I used to believe that maybe he really would. Now he had built something far bigger than I ever dreamed, and yet part of me feared that the world might hurt him the same way people had before. Around noon, the phone rang, and when I picked up, a voice on the other end introduced herself as a lawyer representing my daughter. My stomach dropped. The woman spoke politely, almost too gently, as she explained that my daughter was seeking legal recognition as Ethan's guardian and beneficiary. My hand tightened around the receiver. I said, Ethan is 21 years old. He is an adult. He does not need a guardian. The lawyer paused, then said she would be filing for financial rights as his biological mother. I felt dizzy for a moment, the kind of dizzy that makes the room tilt. I said coldly, you can tell her I will see her in court. After hanging up, I sat there frozen, the sound of the clock ticking too loud in the silence. It was not about the money. It was about her trying to take from him what she never gave. When Ethan came home later that day, I told him what had happened. His face hardened, but his eyes stayed calm. He said, let her try. I will not let her win. We spent that evening gathering documents, receipts, letters from doctors and teachers, every piece of proof that showed who raised him, who paid for his care, who stayed when she walked away. Each paper felt like a wound reopening, a reminder of the nights I cried alone when he was sick, the days I worked double shifts just to afford his therapy, the endless hours spent praying he would find his way. Now all of it had become evidence, a life measured in signatures and dates. A few days later, we sat in the lawyer's office and I could see how exhausted Ethan looked, but he still held my hand tightly. Our lawyer, a kind woman named Julia from Portland, promised she would handle everything, but I knew battles like these were never simple. That night, I could not sleep again. I stood in front of the mirror and studied the lines on my face. Each one felt like a scar left by years of sacrifice, years my daughter threw away like they meant nothing. I thought about the first time she handed me Ethan and said she could not handle it. He was barely 4, and she was already gone before I even said goodbye. That memory cut deeper than any insult or betrayal could. The next morning, Ethan walked into the kitchen with that same steady look I had come to recognize. He said, "Grandma, no matter what happens, we face this together." I nodded, though deep down I was terrified. I had fought so many battles in my life, but this one felt different. This one was not just about protecting him. It was about defending the love we had built from the ground up, a love that no court paper could ever measure. When the first hearing date arrived, I put on my old gray dress, the one I wore when I first got custody of him. And as I buttoned it up, my hand shook slightly. I looked at myself in the mirror and whispered, "You are stronger than you think." Ethan met me by the car, dressed in a black suit, his hair neatly combed, and for a second I saw the little boy he once was hiding behind that calm young man. We drove in silence through the streets of Portland, the city buzzing with life, unaware that inside that small courthouse, my whole world was about to be tested again. That evening, I sat by my window, watching the rain fall softly against the glass. The sound of it used to calm me, but that night it felt heavy, almost suffocating. I kept thinking about everything my daughter had done, the lies, the betrayal, the greed. It all replayed in my head like a film I never wanted to see again. My heart hurt, but not in the same way as before. It was no longer just sadness. There was something sharper inside me now, something that wanted justice. For years, I had lived quietly, never asking for much. I took care of my family, gave them love, cooked their me, and kept our home warm. I believed that kindness always came back around, but now I wasn't so sure. I looked at the old photos on the wall. My daughter as a baby smiling in my arms, my husband beside us, his arm wrapped around me. Those memories felt like ghosts, now fading pieces of a life I could barely recognize. I whispered to myself, she has no idea what she's done. She thinks she can walk back into his life and take what isn't hers, but she doesn't know who she's dealing with, not anymore. The next morning, I woke up with a strange calmness. I made my coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and started writing a letter, not to her, but to the lawyer. I wanted to be ready no matter what happened. My grandson came down, rubbing his eyes. "Good morning, Grandma," he said. I smiled softly. "Good morning, sweetheart. You sleep well." He nodded and sat across from me. I could see he was worried. He had been since the day she came back. He didn't say it, but I knew he felt responsible, like her return somehow threatened the life we built together. After breakfast, I told him we would visit our lawyer again. I wanted him to see the process, to understand that his voice mattered in all of this. As we drove through town, I watched him from the passenger seat. He had grown into such a strong, thoughtful young man. Every little thing he did reminded me of how far we had come together. After the meeting, the lawyer pulled me aside. He said, "She's preparing something big, maybe even media attention. She wants to make you look like you kept her son away from her." I felt my stomach twist. "She would go that far?" He nodded. "Yes, and she's talking to reporters." I could barely breathe for a moment. I held onto the back of a chair, steadying myself. When we got home, my grandson saw my face. He asked, "What happened, Grandma?" I told him everything. Instead of panicking, he took a deep breath and said, "Then we tell our story, our truth." I looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" She said, "We don't hide, Grandma. We speak. We show the world who really raised me." I felt tears forming. He had no fear, no hesitation. His strength gave me strength in return. That night, we sat together planning what to do. He said he wanted to record a message, not for attention, but to make sure no one could twist his words. We sat in the living room, lights dimmed, rain tapping again on the window. He spoke calmly from his heart. He talked about how I raised him, how I stayed by his side through every challenge, every sleepless night, every therapy session, every tear. When he finished, I had tears streaming down my face. He smiled gently and said, "Grandma, we're going to be okay. I promise." I hugged him so tight, I could feel his heartbeat against mine. That boy had grown into a man right before my eyes. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. Sometimes silence can feel heavier than noise. I could sense the storm coming. I looked at her. She wouldn't stay quiet for long. One morning while I was watering the garden, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered and heard a voice from a local news station. They said they wanted to hear my side of the story. My hands trembled slightly, but I agreed. I wasn't going to let her paint me as the villain anymore. That evening, a reporter came over. She was kind, polite. She asked questions and listened carefully. I told her everything, not out of anger, but with truth in my voice. When the story aired, people started to see the truth. Messages poured in from strangers saying they supported us, saying I was an inspiration. It was overwhelming, but in a good way. I felt seen for the first time in years. My daughter, however, didn't like that. She called screaming that I was trying to ruin her reputation. I stayed silent for most of it. And then I said, "You ruined yourself the moment you abandoned your child." She hung up, but I knew this wasn't over. Something in my chest told me the biggest fight was still coming. A few nights later, I found an envelope on my porch. No name, no return address. Inside was a copy of a court document. She was filing for custody of him again, even though he was almost 17. It was her way of attacking through legal means. My hands shook as I read it, but then I noticed something strange at the bottom, a signature that didn't look quite right. It was messy, inconsistent. I took it to our lawyer the next morning. He looked at it for a long time before saying, "This isn't her signature. Someone forged it. Maybe someone working for her." That's when I realized this battle was dirtier than I thought. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about control, and I wasn't about to let her win, not this time. That night, I could barely sleep. The shadows in my room felt longer than usual, and my thoughts wouldn't rest. Every memory of my daughter played over in my mind. From the time she took her first steps to the moment she drove away 12 years ago without looking back, it was hard to accept that the little girl I once held in my arms was now the same woman trying to destroy the life I built with her son. I turned to look at the framed photo of my grandson on his 10th birthday, his bright smile caught in the glow of candlelight. That smile was the only reason I had kept going all those years, the reason I pushed through loneliness, through fear, through every sleepless night. I got out of bed and made myself a cup of tea. The sound of the kettle seemed too loud in the quiet house. I stood by the kitchen window watching the streetlights reflect on the wet pavement. Everything looked still, but inside me, a storm was brewing. I knew what she was doing. She was trying to wear me down, to make me feel small, to make me surrender, but she forgot one thing. I wasn't that fragile woman she left behind years ago. I was stronger now, forged by pain and survival. The next morning, I met our lawyer again. He said the hearing was scheduled for next month. He looked tired, like he'd seen this kind of cruelty before. He warned me that she might dig into my finances, that she would question how I spent money on her son. I told him I didn't care. I had nothing to hide. I spent every dollar with love and purpose. Every bill was for his therapy, his education, his comfort. I had receipts. And even if I didn't, I had the truth. After the meeting, I drove to the lake, a quiet spot just outside town where I used to take my grandson when he was little. The air smelled like pine and wet soil. I sat on the bench and closed my eyes where I could hear children laughing in the distance. It reminded me of when he used to play with his toy boats on the water. Those were simpler days. I wished I could go back, but life doesn't give you that luxury. When I came home, he was working on his computer. His focus always amazed me. He looked up and smiled when I walked in. I asked how it was going, and he said he was close to finishing a new version of his app. The pride in his voice made me forget everything for a moment. He had built something incredible, something that came from his mind, his patience, and his passion. And now she wanted a piece of it just because she shared his blood. That thought made my chest tighten. I went upstairs and opened the old chest where I kept letters and photos. I found one from her written years ago, short and cold, saying she needed space. I traced my fingers over the paper, feeling the distance in every word. I remembered the night she left, the way she avoided my eyes, the way she tossed her keys on the counter and said she couldn't handle motherhood anymore. I stood there frozen, too stunned to speak. I never blamed her for being overwhelmed. I just thought she'd come back when she was ready. But she never did. Now, after all this time, she had returned not for love, but for greed. That realization broke something inside me. I sat on the floor with that letter in my hand, tears falling quietly. But after a few minutes, the tears stopped, replaced by a kind of calm that felt dangerous. I knew what I had to do. If she wanted to drag this fight into the public eye, then I would give her truth she couldn't twist. I picked up my phone and called a friend, an old journalist I knew from church. I asked if we could meet. She agreed. The next morning, we sat at a small cafe in downtown Portland. The air smelled of coffee and rain. I told her everything from the day my daughter left to the moment she returned with the lawyer there. Fucking rain and downtown Portland. She listened quietly, her eyes soft but focused. When I finished, she said, "You should let me publish this. Not as a scandal, but as a story of strength." I hesitated, worried it might hurt my grandson. But when I told him later, he said, "Grandma, if your truth helps even one person, you should share it." Grandma, if your truth helps even one person, you should share it. I realized he was right. So I gave my permission. Within a week, the article went live and something unexpected happened. People from all over sent messages, mothers, grandparents, even strangers who said my story reminded them of their own battles. I read every message. Some made me cry. Some made me smile. And for the first time in years, I felt less enuma and battles. But not everyone was happy. She called again, her voice colder than ever. She said, "You made me look like a monster." I replied quietly, "I didn't make you look like anything. You did that yourself." She hung up. But her silence afterward was louder than any word she could have spoken. I knew she was planning something and I could feel it coming, but I wasn't afraid anymore, Connie. But I wasn't 30 down because I had something she didn't, the truth and the love of the boy she left behind. The morning of the hearing arrived with a kind of stillness that made my heart ache. The air was cold and heavy, and even the sky looked bruised, gray with streaks of pale light breaking through the clouds. I stood in front of the mirror, buttoning my coat, staring at my reflection. My hands trembled just a little. Suz, it took not from fear, but from the weight of everything that had led to this moment. 12 years of struggle, love, and sleepless nights, all coming down to one day in a courtroom. My grandson came downstairs wearing his Navy suit. He looked older than his age. His calmness both comforted and scared me. He smiled and said, "You ready, Grandma?" I nodded, but my throat felt tight, buddy. As we drove through the streets of Portland, the city felt unfamiliar, like it was holding its breath with us. When we reached the courthouse, there were people standing outside, reporters mostly, cameras flashing, microphones waving. I could hear my name whispered in the crowd. The article had spread further than I expected, and now everyone wanted to see the woman who raised the boy behind the multi-million-dollar app. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. My grandson held my arm gently, guiding me through the noise inside the courthouse. Everything smelled like old paper and polished wood. Everything smelled like old paper and polished wood, cheddar. The sound of footsteps echoed against the marble floor when we entered the courtroom. My daughter was already there, dressed sharply, sitting beside her lawyer. She looked at me briefly, her face unreadable, but her eyes held something sharp like a blade she wanted to twist thy sadness and anger that and to twist thy sadness and anger across from her, feeling a strange mix of sadness and anger. She looked at me briefly, her face unreadable, but her eyes held something sharply, sitting a strange mix of sadness and anger. But why? With the same heart, nah. It wasn't supposed to be like this, a mother and daughter fighting in front of strangers. The judge entered and everyone rose. His voice was calm but firm as he began the proceedings. Her lawyer spoke first, painting her as a misunderstood woman who made mistakes but wanted to reconnect with her son. I felt my hands clench into fists on my lap. Every word he said sounded rehearsed, distant from the truth. Then our lawyer stood and spoke for us. He talked about the years of abandonment, the therapy bills, the sleepless nights, the school meetings, the love that filled every missing piece. As he spoke, I could see some people in the audience nodding quietly. Bro, it even the judge's expression softened for a moment. Then my daughter's lawyer called her to the stand. She walked up slowly, her heels clicking against the floor. She began talking about regret, about second chances. Her voice broke at all the right moments, but I had heard her lies for too long to be moved when it was my turn to speak. Her voice broke at all the right moments, but I had heard her lies for too long to be moved when it was my turn to speak. Effed. I stood and felt the weight of every year in my bones. I told them the truth, simple and raw. I told them about the night she left, about the small hand that clung to mine, crying for his mother, about the years I spent learning how to help him navigate a world that didn't understand him, help him navigate a world that didn't understand him. I told them love isn't about blood. It's about showing up when no one else will. When I finished, the room was silent. I could hear the hum of the ceiling fan. My daughter wouldn't look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on the table. Then the judge asked my grandson to speak. He stood tall and steady, his voice deep but calm. He said, Your Honor, I'm not here because of money. And I'm here because I have a family, and it's her. Pointing at me, she's the one who stayed. She's the one who believed in me when no one did. My mother may have given me life, but she didn't give me love, and that's what matters. When he sat down, I could no longer hold my tears. They fell quietly, but I didn't hide them. The judge looked at all of us for a long moment before saying he needed time to review. The gavel came down and the hearing was over. As people began to leave, I stayed sitting frozen in that seat, my heart still racing. My daughter walked past me without a word. Outside the courthouse, the air felt lighter. The reporters called out questions, but I ignored them. My grandson squeezed my hand and said, We did it, Grandma. Whatever happens, we did it. I smiled through the tears because deep down I knew he was right. The truth was already out there, and no matter what the judge decided, she could never take that away from us. The days after the hearing felt longer than usual. Every morning I woke up before sunrise, made my coffee, and sat by the window watching the fog roll through the street. The world outside kept moving, but my mind stayed stuck inside that courtroom, replaying every word, every look, every pause, waiting for the final decision. Was like living between two heartbeats. My daughter had gone quiet since the hearing. No calls, no messages, nothing. That silence felt louder than any argument we ever had. My grandson tried to keep things normal. He still worked on his projects, still smiled at me across the breakfast table, but I could see the tension hiding behind his eyes. One afternoon, I found him sitting in the garage, staring at the old toolbox his grandfather once used. He looked lost in thought. I asked what was wrong. He said, Grandma, I keep wondering why she did it, why she left, why she came back up, wondering why she did it, why she left, why she came back up. But I kid not what run they're staying be in the garage, staying Grandma run. I kid not wondering why she did it, why she left, why she came back up. I sat beside him and said, sometimes people don't know how to love right. They think love is something you can walk away from, but it's not. It's something that lives inside you, even when you try to bury it. He nodded slowly, then smiled a little. You always make it sound so simple, Grandma. I laughed softly because sometimes simple is the only way I can survive it. But that night I lay awake thinking about her, about how broken things had become between us. I wondered if she felt any regret, any real pain for what she did. part of me wanted her to, but another part just wanted peace. 2 days later, the call came. It was our lawyer. His voice was calm, but I could tell he was holding something back. He said the judge had reached a decision. I asked him to tell me right then, but he insisted on meeting in person. My heart thudded through my chest the whole drive to his office. The sky was overcast again, the same gray tone it had on the day of the hearing. When we sat down, he handed me a copy of the ruling. I took a deep breath before reading it. My hands shook as my eyes moved across the page. The words felt like a wave crashing over me. The court had ruled in our favor. Full guardianship and control of all financial assets remained with me and my grandson. Her petition was denied. I looked up at him, barely breathing. My grandson, her petition was denied. I looked up at him, barely breathing. And baby crosses with to sign which feel to say we were by wave crashing over me. The court had ruled in our favor. Petted maid construe. Her petition was denied. I looked up at him, barely. He smiled softly and said, "You did it. You told the truth and the truth won." Tears filled my eyes, but they weren't just tears of relief. They were tears of relief of 12 years of holding everything together, finally breaking free. I drove home slowly. Every mile felt lighter, and my grandson was waiting at the door. One look at my face and he knew. He shouted, "We won," and pulled me into a hug so tight I thought my heart would burst. I laughed and cried all at once. The sound of it echoed through the house like a song of freedom. Later that night, we sat on the porch watching the sunset, the sky painted in soft pinks and gold. I told him this victory wasn't just ours, it was a lesson that truth might bend, but it never breaks. He rested his head on my shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for never giving up on me." I told him, "Thank you for giving me a reason to keep going." We sat there in silence, two souls stitched together by love, by survival, by everything we endured. But deep down, I knew it wasn't completely over. People like my daughter don't disappear quietly. And though I didn't know what she would do next, I was no longer afraid. I had faced the worst and still stood tall. I had built a life out of ashes, and if she ever tried to burn it again, I'd remind her that I learned how to rise from fire long before she ever learned how to light a match. The morning after the verdict, the world felt new, like the air had finally cleared after years of suffocating storms. I woke up early, sunlight spilling across the kitchen floor. I brewed coffee and let the warmth settle into my hands, trend and tryings. Rose. It had been so long since I felt peace, real peace, the kind that doesn't come from winning, but from surviving. My grandson came downstairs humming to himself, his face glowing with a kind of quiet pride. He kissed my cheek and said, "Good morning, Grandma. We made it." I smiled because those words held everything we had fought for. I told him life gives us battles we never asked for, but the ones we survive make us who we are. We spent that day doing nothing special, just living, laughing, breathing without fear. Later, we took a walk through the park, leaves crunching under our shoes. The air smelled of pine and distant rain. We stopped by the lake where I used to bring him as a child. He threw a pebble across the water and said, "Do you think she'll ever change?" I took a moment before answering, "Maybe one day, but even if she doesn't, we've already healed." He nodded quietly. I could see a man in him now, not the boy who once cried for his mother, but someone shaped by love that never left it. Abyss. Potties. No, that night as the sun sank behind the hills, I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the golden light fade. I thought about my daughter, about all the years lost between us. Part of me still loved her. How could I not? But I also knew love didn't mean letting her break us again. She had to live with her choices, just like I had to live with mine. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. It was her. She wrote, "I hope you're happy." I stared at the screen for a long time before typing back, "I'm not happy that you lost. I'm happy that we survived." Then I put the phone down and never looked back. The next morning, I found my grandson sitting at his desk, his laptop open, lines of code glowing on the screen. He said, "Grandma, I'm working on something new. It's a program that helps families connect with special needs children through communication tools." He smiled. "I want it to be free for everyone." I felt tears fill my eyes again, not from sadness, but from pride so deep it hurt. I walked over and hugged him, telling him his heart was the best thing he ever built. Days turned into weeks and peace slowly became normal again. The world outside moved fast, interviews, success, recognition, but inside our little home, everything stayed simple, just love, laughter, friends, so in both, and the soft rhythm of life returning to normal. One evening, I lit a candle by the window, something I used to do years ago when I felt lost. I whispered a small prayer for her, for me, for all the mothers who gave too much and got too little in return. I realized forgiveness wasn't about letting someone back in. It was about freeing yourself from their shadow. I had spent 12 years fighting for love. And now I finally understood it wasn't something you earn. It's something you choose to give, no matter who walks away. As the candle burned low, I looked around my quiet home and smiled. It wasn't perfect, but it was in tea. Matter who walks away as the candle burned low. I looked around my quiet home and smiled. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Supposed to install it smaller. Wasn't perfect, but it was burst. And handle stall it. Wasn't perfect, but it was Dari, built from patience, sacrifice, and unshakable love. I knew she might return someday, but this time I'd be ready, not with anger, but with the strength of a woman who had already faced the worst and still stood tall, the kind of strength that comes from surviving heartbreak and turning it into hope, the kind that leaves scars, but also stories. And this one was mine to tell them. The kind that leaves scars, but also and this question workwood to Pabial doll. And now to everyone listening, if my story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Her voice, share it with someone who believes love can rise even from the deepest betrayal. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your stories matter too, and I'll be right here waiting to share the next one with you.